Michael didn't just let go of Nkiru's hand, he shoved her bouquet against her chest so hard she stumbled, the white roses crushing against her lace bodice. Before the gasp could leave her throat, he snatched the silver microphone from the stunned priest's hand. A sharp, piercing screech of feedback sliced through the floral-scented air of the Lagos Cathedral, making 500 of Nigeria's elite winced in unison. "I'm done playing the fool," Michael's voice boomed, distorted and cold. "I wouldn't marry a woman who belongs to the streets, let alone give my name to a lie like Nkiru's." He tossed the microphone onto the altar, the heavy thud echoing like a gunshot, and turned his back on her. "They say your wedding day is the best day of your life. For me, it was the day I died in front of 500 people. My groom didn't just leave me, he used a microphone to shatter my heart and my reputation in one breath. But as I stood there in the wreckage of my life, a man with ink on his neck and ice in his veins was waiting in the shadows to pick up the pieces. He didn't offer me a tissue. He offered me a throne. This is the story of how I stopped being a victim and started being a queen. Stay with me until the end, because the choice this man makes at the final hour is something you have to see to believe." Before we dive into the shadows of the Lagos Cathedral, do me a huge favor, hit that like button and subscribe to join our growing community. It helps us bring more of these high-stakes stories to life. And I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments below. The public shaming, Nkiru stood paralyzed. The warm Nigerian sun streaming through the stained glass felt suddenly like a spotlight on her execution. A sea of smartphones rose in the pews like a digital firing squad, the flashes of cameras capturing the mascara tracks already beginning to ruin her bridal glow. The whispers started, a low, rhythmic buzzing of judgment that stripped her of her dignity faster than Michael ever could. The mysterious observer, in the very last row, amidst the colorful gellies and expensive agbadas, sat a man who didn't fit. He didn't have a phone out. He wasn't whispering. Han Tae-jun sat with a terrifying, disciplined stillness, his jet-black hair perfectly parted and a sharp-line tattoo creeping up the side of his neck like a warning. His narrowed, focused eyes didn't show shock, they showed a predatory intent, as if he had been waiting for the exact moment the groom's pride would cave. The intervention, as Michael reached the heavy oak doors of the church, Nkiru finally found her feet. "Michael, wait," she sobbed, her hand reaching out in a desperate, instinctive plea to stop the ruin of her life. She didn't make it 2 steps. A firm, gloved hand clamped around her wrist, not with malice, but with a gravitational certainty that stopped her breath. "Don't," a low, smooth voice commanded. Tae-jun stood over her, his presence occupying her personal space with the weight of a mountain. "You do not chase a man who used a microphone to tell the world you are worthless." The altar takeover, Tae-jun didn't wait for her permission. With fluid, lethal grace, he walked toward the altar. The congregation fell into a deathly silence as the man in the tailored black suit picked up the fallen microphone. He didn't look at the crowd, he looked only at Nkiru, his expression quietly decisive. "The groom is a boy who doesn't know the value of what he held," Tae-jun's voice resonated through the speakers, calm and dominant. He stepped into the empty space Michael had left behind. "I am a man who does. I'll marry her." The cathedral air, once heavy with the scent of expensive lilies and the joyful buzz of 500 guests, curdled into something suffocating. Nkiru felt the sting before she understood the insult. Michael's hand, which had promised a lifetime of protection only moments ago, shoved her bridal bouquet into her chest with a jagged, dismissive force. White petals drifted to the marble floor like falling ash. Before she could regain her balance, Michael reached for the microphone on the priest's podium. The screech of electronic feedback tore through the church, a violent herald of the carnage to come. "I'm not doing this," Michael's voice boomed, his Nigerian accent sharpened by a cruel, calculated edge. He looked at the front row, at her parents, at the dignitaries, at the cameras, and sneered. "I thought I was marrying a woman of virtue, but Nkiru belongs to the streets. I refuse to give the Balogun name to a lie." He dropped the microphone. The heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards and into Nkiru's bones. As Michael turned and marched down the aisle, a digital firestorm ignited. 500 phones rose in unison, a shimmering wall of lenses capturing her ruin. The whispers followed, thick, venomous, and swift. "Michael, please." The cry left Nkiru's lips before she could stop it. Blinding tears smudged her mascara as she stumbled forward, her heavy silk train snagging on the altar steps. She was a woman drowning in public, reaching for the very hand that had pushed her under. She didn't reach him. A shadow intercepted her. A man who had been sitting in the shadows of the back pews was suddenly there, moving with the silent, predatory grace of a panther. A firm, steady hand clamped around Nkiru's wrist, halting her mid-stride. The touch was cool, grounding, and absolute. "Stop," the stranger said. The word wasn't loud, but it possessed a psychological weight that silenced the room. Nkiru looked up, her breath hitching. He was East Asian, his skin pale and clear against the charcoal darkness of a suit that cost more than Michael's entire wedding budget. A sharp, modern tattoo climbed the side of his neck, disappearing beneath a jawline so precise it looked carved from flint. Han Tae-jun didn't look at the crowd, his narrowed, focused eyes were fixed entirely on her. "You do not beg for the scrapings of a coward's heart," he said, his voice a low, melodic silk. Tae-jun stepped past her, ascending the altar steps Michael had just vacated. He picked up the discarded microphone. His presence was so dominant, so alien to the traditional surroundings, that the gossiping guests froze. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at the priest. He looked back at Nkiru, his expression a mask of quiet, ironclad decision. "The contract has been vacated," Tae-jun announced to the stunned cathedral. "The boy has left. I will take his place. I will marry her." The silence that followed Han Tae-jun's declaration was more violent than Michael's shouting had been. It was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the cathedral until Nkiru's lungs burned. She looked at the stranger, this man with the ink of a criminal and the bearing of a king, and then at the back of the church. Michael had stopped. He stood by the heavy oak doors, his face a mask of twitching disbelief. He had expected her to crawl. He hadn't expected to be replaced before his seat was even cold. "Nkiru, no," her mother's voice pierced the air, a high, thin wail of traditional propriety and genuine terror. "You don't know this man. Come away." Nkiru looked at her mother's tear-stained face, then at the wall of glowing phone screens recording her shame for every WhatsApp group in Lagos. If she stayed, she was a victim. If she stayed, she was the girl who was discarded. Taejun stepped down from the altar and extended a hand. He didn't offer a smile. There was no warmth in his dark eyes, only a cold, crystalline promise of sanctuary. "The jet is waiting," he said, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. "Decide now. The life you knew ended the moment he dropped that microphone. Do you want to mourn it, or do you want to outrun it?" Nkiru didn't look back at Michael. She didn't look at the aunties whispering behind their fans. She reached out, her trembling fingers disappearing into Taejun's firm, gloved grip. The contact felt like a spark of electricity in a dark room. He led her down the aisle with a terrifyingly calm pace. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, the sheer gravity of Taejun's presence repelling anyone who dared to step forward. As they passed Michael, the former groom reached out, his voice a strangled hiss. "Nkiru, wait, you can't just." Taejun didn't even break his stride. He simply shifted his weight, a subtle, predatory tilt of his shoulder that forced Michael to recoil as if he'd been struck. They stepped out of the cathedral into the sweltering Lagos heat, where a line of 3 black armored SUVs sat idling. The transition was a blur of tinted glass and high-speed turns. Within 20 minutes, the chaos of the city faded into the private tarmac of Murtala Muhammad International Airport. A sleek, matte black Gulfstream sat waiting, its engines already whining with a low, hungry power. As the stairs hissed shut behind them, the humidity of Nigeria was replaced by the recycled, expensive air of the cabin. Nkiru stood in the center of the plush interior, her white sleeveless gown looking ghostly against the charcoal leather. Taejun unbuttoned his suit jacket, revealing the holster strapped to his ribs, a flash of steel that confirmed every rumor she hadn't yet heard. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a seat. "The world is going to look for you, Nkiru. By the time we land in Seoul, they won't be able to find the woman who was stood up at the altar." Nkiru sank into the chair, the heavy silk of her wedding dress feeling like a shroud she was finally ready to shed. The transition from the sweltering chaos of Lagos to the sterile, midnight chill of Seoul felt less like a flight and more like a rebirth into a colder dimension. When the Gulfstream's doors opened, the air was sharp and smelled of rain and ozone. Nkiru, still wrapped in a heavy cashmere coat Taejun's staff had provided over her wedding dress, followed him into a waiting limousine. She watched the city through the tinted windows, a neon-drenched labyrinth of steel and light that seemed to pulse in synchronization with the man sitting silently beside her. They bypassed the heart of the city, ascending a private road that led to a monolithic spire of glass and black iron. The iron penthouse occupied the top 3 floors, a fortress in the sky that overlooked the Han River like a gargoyle watching its territory. As the elevator doors hissed open directly into the living suite, Nkiru froze. The space was cavernous, minimalist, and terrifyingly beautiful, furnished in shades of slate and obsidian. "This is your home now," Taejun said, shedding his coat to reveal the crisp white shirt beneath. He moved to a floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the grid of lights below. Nkiru walked toward the glass, her reflection a pale, ghostly blur. From this height, the cars looked like slow-moving embers. "Why here?" she whispered, her voice sounding fragile in the vast room. "Why me?" Taejun didn't turn around, but his reflection in the glass was sharp, his narrowed eyes tracking something in the distance. "In Lagos, you were a scandal. In Seoul, under my name, you are a message." People think they know who owns this city, Nkiru. They see the politicians and the CEOs. They don't see the shadow that moves beneath them. As if on cue, a wall of monitors embedded in the far wall flickered to life. They didn't show news or movies. Instead, they displayed silent, high-definition feeds of shipping docks, flickering server rooms, and men in dark suits standing guard in nondescript hallways. One screen showed a digital map of the city, pulsating with red icons, assets, Nkiru realized with a jolt of fear. She looked at the man she had technically married on a whim of survival. He wasn't just a businessman with a dangerous edge, he was the architect of the city's unseen pulse. On a side table lay a Korean newspaper. Even though she couldn't read the script, his face was on the front page, though the photo was grainy, taken from a distance. Below it, the headline was bold and underscored. Nkiru realized then that she hadn't just escaped a bad marriage. She had stepped into a war. Han Tae-jun was the shadow ruler of Seoul, and by taking his hand at the altar, she had become the newest, most vulnerable territory in his empire. The silence of the penthouse was broken only by the rhythmic hum of the server banks. Tae-jun poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass, the ice clinking with a surgical precision that set Nkiru's nerves on edge. He didn't offer her a drink. Instead, he gestured toward a leather-bound folder lying on the obsidian desk. "You are wondering if I am a romantic, Nkiru," he began, his voice cutting through the chill of the room. He finally turned, the light from the city skyline catching the sharp angles of his jaw. "You are wondering if I flew across the world to save a stranger because my heart bled for her humiliation." Nkiru didn't move. The thought had crossed my mind. Along with the thought that I might be a prisoner. Tae-jun's lips didn't curve into a smile, but his eyes darkened with a flicker of something resembling respect. "I am many things, but I am not a savior. I am a collector of debts." He tapped the folder. "Open it." With trembling fingers, Nkiru flipped the cover. Inside were surveillance photos, bank ledgers, and blurred images of Michael Balogun. But this wasn't the Michael she knew, the man who boasted about his real estate holdings in Lagos. This Michael was huddled in a dimly lit basement in Macau, sweating profusely, surrounded by men whose faces were obscured by shadows. "Your fiancé was a small man with large appetites," Tae-jun said, walking closer until Nkiru could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco. "He didn't just work in finance. He moved money for my organization's rivals. And then, he decided he was cleverer than the people who gave him his start. He stole $4 million from a subsidiary of the Han Group to pay for your wedding, your ring, and his own mounting gambling debts." Nkiru felt the blood drain from her face. The white dress she still wore, the lace, the silk, the delicate beading, suddenly felt like it was made of lead. It was stolen property. "He intended to leave you at that altar regardless of your virtue," Tae-jun continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The humiliation was a smokescreen. He needed a public scene to vanish, to make the world look at your heartbreak while he slipped away to his handlers. By stepping in, I didn't just save your dignity. I seized the only asset he had left that mattered to his pride." Nkiru looked up at him, her eyes wide. "I'm a ransom note." "You are the wife of Han Tae-jun," he corrected, his hand reaching out to tilt her chin up, forcing her to meet his icy gaze. In my world, that makes you untouchable to him, and a target to everyone else. Michael is a rat, Nkiru. And I find that the best way to catch a rat is to keep the prize he thought he'd already won. The morning sun didn't warm the iron penthouse, it merely highlighted its sharp edges. Nkiru stood in the center of a dressing suite that felt more like an armory. On the obsidian table sat a row of velvet-lined boxes containing diamonds that looked like shards of frozen light. Beside them, a seamstress moved in silence, pinning a structured, charcoal-colored suit to Nkiru's frame. The lace of her wedding gown had been discarded on the floor, a white ghost of a woman who no longer existed. Taejun entered, his reflection appearing in the three-way mirror behind her. He didn't look at the jewelry. He looked at her posture. "You are leaning," he said, his voice a low, rhythmic rasp. "You are waiting for someone to give you permission to occupy this space. That is a luxury you can no longer afford." He walked toward her, the sound of his Italian leather shoes echoing like a countdown. He stopped inches from her back, not touching her, yet she could feel the heat radiating from him. "In Lagos, you were taught to be soft to survive. Here, softness is a scent that attracts predators. If you look like a victim, you will become one." He reached out, his fingers brushing the back of her neck, just above the line where his own tattoo began, and forced her chin upward. "Eyes up. Never look at the ground. The ground is for the people who serve you. You look at the horizon, or you look through the person speaking to you as if they are glass." "I don't know how to be this person," Nkiru whispered, her reflection looking back at her with wide, terrified eyes. "Then act," Taejun commanded. "Walk to the door. Not like a bride. Like a debt collector." Nkiru took a step, her heels clicking tentatively. Taejun cut her off, his movements a blur of lethal efficiency. He grabbed her shoulder, grounding her. "No. You are hesitant. You are worried about the noise you make. I want you to make the floor regret you stepped on it. Your shoulders are back because you carry the weight of the Han Group, not because you are afraid of a scandal." He spent the next hour stripping away her Nigerian politeness, replacing it with a cold, aesthetic armor. He taught her the Mafia silence, the art of letting a question hang in the air until the other person choked on their own nerves. He showed her how to hold a champagne flute like a weapon and how to tilt her head just enough to signal disdain without saying a word. By the time he was finished, the woman in the mirror had changed. The warmth in her medium brown skin had been sharpened by a mask of indifference. Her expressive eyes were hooded, mimicking his own focused gaze. "Good," Taejun murmured, standing behind her, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. "Now, when Michael looks at you, he won't see the woman he broke. He will see the woman who will bury him." The silence of the iron penthouse was shattered not by a command from Taejun, but by the frantic vibration of a phone Nkiru had thought she'd silenced forever. It sat on a minimalist marble console, skittering like a trapped insect. The caller ID didn't show a name, only a string of digits she knew by heart, a ghost from a life that felt a century old. Nkiru didn't reach for it. She practiced the Mafia silence Taejun had drilled into her, watching the screen glow until it went dark, only for it to scream back to life seconds later. Finally, she picked it up. "Nkiru? Nkiru, is that you? Please, pick up." Michael's voice was unrecognizable. The arrogant, booming tone he had used at the altar was gone, replaced by a high-pitched, ragged desperation. Behind him, she could hear the chaotic roar of a Lego street, the honking of Danfo buses and the thick humidity of a world she had escaped. "What do you want, Michael?" she asked. Her voice was steady, a cool blade forged in Seoul's winter. She stood by the window, her reflection tall and unyielding in her new charcoal suit. "Thank God," he gasped, his breath hitching. "Nkiru, listen to me. I made a mistake. That man, that Korean man you're with, he's dangerous. He's a monster. You have to come back. I can explain everything, I swear. I only said those things to protect you from the people I owe." "You said those things to protect yourself," she countered, her thumb tracing the cold edge of the marble. "And you didn't say them, you screamed them into a microphone. I was pressured. Nkiru, please, I'm in trouble. Deep trouble. The men here, they found out I lost my leverage. They know you're with the Han group now." His voice dropped to a pathetic, shivering whisper. "They said if I can't get the money back from Taejun, they're going to kill me. You're his wife now. You have access. Just 5 million, Nkiru. That's all I need to clear the debt. For the sake of everything we were, please. Save me." Nkiru felt a strange sensation in her chest. It wasn't the searing pain of a broken heart, but the cold, clinical click of a puzzle piece falling into place. She realized Michael wasn't calling because he missed her. He was calling because he viewed her as a backdoor to a vault. "You aren't asking for forgiveness, Michael," she said, her eyes narrowing as she watched Taejun enter the room, his gaze instantly locking onto the phone in her hand. "You're asking for a payout. Nkiru, I'm begging you." She didn't wait for the rest. She pressed the end call button with a slow, deliberate pressure. She didn't block him. She simply set the phone down, face up, and looked at Taejun. "He's begging," she said. Taejun walked over, his presence a dark, comforting weight. He didn't ask what was said, he knew. He reached out, his thumb brushing over the screen of her phone. "The ghost is hungry," he murmured. "Let him starve a little longer. A man who begs is a man who is ready to be used." The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and shadows, illuminated only by the rhythmic pulsing of the city below. Nkiru walked through the darkened hallway, the silk of her robe whispering against the floor. She had intended to go to the kitchen, but a sliver of light from the master suite's dressing room caught her eye. The door was ajar, and the air carried the sharp, medicinal scent of antiseptic. She stopped. Taejun stood with his back to her, his shirt discarded on a velvet bench. He was a man who moved with the perfection of a machine, but in the dim light, the illusion of invincibility shattered. His back was a map of violence. Amidst the elegant, swirling ink of his tattoos were the jagged, silver lines of old scars, knife work, rope burns, and the unmistakable circular puckers of bullet wounds. One particularly fresh laceration ran across his shoulder blade, weeping a slow trail of red that he was trying, and failing, to reach with a gauze pad. Nkiru didn't think, she moved. She pushed the door open softly. Taejun's body went rigid, his hand reflexively darting toward a drawer where she knew he kept a weapon, but he relaxed when he caught her scent in the mirror. "I didn't hear you," he murmured, his voice sounding thinner, stripped of its public authority. "You're bleeding," Kira said, stepping into the circle of light. She took the antiseptic and the gauze from his hand. He didn't protest, though his muscles tightened as she pressed the cool cloth to his skin. As she worked, she saw more than just the wounds. She saw the tension held in the tendons of his neck, the way his breath hitched when she touched a particularly sensitive area. This was the man behind the monster, the physical cost of being the shadow that ruled Seoul. Each scar was a story of a betrayal survived, a price paid for the throne he sat upon. "Does it ever stop?" she asked quietly, her fingers grazing the edge of the dark tattoo on his neck. Taejun turned his head slightly, looking at her over his shoulder. In the silence, the coldness in his eyes had melted into a weary, profound vulnerability. "Power is not a destination, Nkiru. It is a siege. You spend your life building walls, and then you spend the rest of it making sure no one climbs them." For a moment, the distance between them, the contract, the debt, the ocean between their worlds, collapsed. Nkiru realized that they were the same. She had been scarred by words and public shame, he had been scarred by steel and lead. Both of them were survivors, hiding their wounds behind expensive suits and iron masks. Taejun turned fully then, his hand coming up to cover hers against his shoulder. He didn't pull her closer, but he didn't let go. For the first time, he wasn't looking at her as a student or an asset. He was looking at her as the only person in the world who knew he could bleed. The Red Gala was held in a subterranean ballroom beneath a museum of ancient art, a place where the history of Korea's past met the cold, predatory wealth of its present. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the sharp, metallic tang of hidden agendas. Nkiru stepped off the elevator, her hand resting on Taejun's arm. She wore a gown of deep crimson silk that clung to her curves like a second skin, its structural neckline echoing the sharp lines of the iron penthouse. Around her neck sat a choker of black diamonds, a collar that signaled her status as the Han Group's most guarded asset. "Remember," Taejun whispered, his lips barely moving against her ear. "They aren't looking for a bride. They are looking for a weakness. Give them stone." As they moved through the crowd, the sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns parted in a ripple of hushed Korean. Nkiru felt the weight of 100 gazes, calculating, skeptical, and hungry. They reached the center of the room, where a circle of older men stood, their faces weathered by decades of shadow wars. One man, Chairman Park, stepped forward. His eyes were like glass shards as he looked Nkiru up and down. "So, this is the Lagos Prize," Park said in accented English, his voice a dry rasp. "A sudden marriage to a woman from a broken altar. Tell me, Director Han, is the Han Group so desperate for stability that you must import it from a wedding disaster?" A low titter of laughter moved through the circle. Nkiru felt the heat rise in her chest, the familiar, stinging shame of the cathedral, but then she felt the ghost of Taejun's hand on her chin from the morning's lesson. She didn't look at Taejun for help. She looked directly into Park's eyes, tilting her head with a slow, practiced disdain. "Stability isn't imported, Chairman," Nkiru said, her voice a cool, melodic blade that cut through the laughter. "It is seized." Michael Balogun thought he was discarding a wife. He didn't realize he was handing his seat at the table to a woman who actually knows how to keep it. She paused, letting the silence hang until the chairman's smile began to falter. I understand you have several shipping lanes currently stalled in the Gulf of Guinea. Perhaps you should be less concerned with where I came from, and more concerned with whether I decide to let your cargo pass. The silence that followed was absolute. Taejun's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her arm, not in warning, but in approval. Park's eyes narrowed, the mockery replaced by a wary, newfound respect. He bowed his head a fraction of an inch, a silent acknowledgement of her rank. Nkiru didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply took a sip of her champagne, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk's. She had passed the first test. She was no longer the humiliated bride in the white lace, she was the lady of the Han group, and she was just beginning to like the view from the throne. The triumph of the Red Gala had left a lingering adrenaline in Nkiru's veins, but as the limousine glided into the private garage of the Iron Penthouse, the atmosphere shifted. The usual guard of four was missing, replaced by an oppressive, heavy silence that smelled of spent gunpowder and ozone. Before Taejun could step out, his phone buzzed, a priority alert that forced him to stay back for a critical second. "Go up," he murmured, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "I will be right behind you." Nkiru stepped into the private elevator, her crimson skirts rustling against the cold metal. But as the doors slid shut, the lift didn't ascend to the penthouse. It dropped. It plunged into the sublevels of the building, the lights flickering to a harsh, sickly yellow. When the doors finally hissed open, she wasn't met by the luxury of her home, but by the concrete grit of a loading bay. Standing there was Captain Khan, a man whose loyalty to the Han group had spanned a decade. He wasn't alone. Two men with tactical vests stood behind him, their faces masked. "I expected you to be smarter than this, Nkiru," Khan said, his voice echoing off the damp walls. He didn't look at her with the respect the others had shown at the gala, he looked at her as an interloper, a foreign contagion. "Taejun is blinded. He's pouring resources into Lagos to spite a man who is beneath us. He's forgotten that a king who protects a bird instead of his borders is no king at all." Nkiru stood her ground, her hand tightening around the strap of her clutch. "You're committing treason, Khan. Do you think Taejun will let you live for this?" "Taejun won't find you," Khan sneered, signaling his men to move forward. "You're going to be the leverage I need to force him to step down. A kidnapped bride is a stain he can't wash off. By the time he realizes you're gone, the board will have already voted." The two men closed in, their shadows lengthening across the concrete. Nkiru felt the familiar prickle of fear, the same helplessness she'd felt at the altar when Michael's voice boomed over the speakers. But then she felt the weight of the diamonds at her neck and the memory of Taejun's voice, "The ground is for the people who serve you." She didn't scream. She didn't beg. As the first man reached for her arm, Nkiru reached into her clutch. Her fingers closed around the heavy, silver-plated microphone Taejun had given her, not for singing, but as a weighted tactical tool. With a sharp, practiced motion, she swung, the metal connecting with the man's temple with a sickening thud. As he crumpled, she backed into the elevator, her eyes locked on Khan. "I was a bride who lost everything in front of 500 people, she hissed, her voice a cold, lethal promise. "Do you really think I'm afraid of you?" The heavy elevator doors hissed shut just as Kong lunged, his fingers grazing the silk of her sleeve before the steel barrier cut him off. Nkiru pressed the override button for the penthouse, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't safe yet. The elevator hummed, ascending with a sickening speed, but the lights flickered. Kang's men were cutting the power. When the doors opened into the penthouse, the sanctuary was gone. The floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the red emergency strobes pulsing from the hallway. Nkiru kicked off her heels, the cold marble biting into her feet, and ran toward the master suite. She knew the layout of this fortress better than the intruders. She had spent weeks memorizing its exits while learning to be its queen. A crash echoed from the kitchen, the sound of the private entrance being breached. They were coming through the service lift. Nkiru didn't hide under the bed. Instead, she reached for the heavy, obsidian base of a designer lamp, shattering the bulb to create a jagged weapon. She remembered Taejun's hands on her shoulders, his voice a low rasp in the dark. Never let them see your fear, let them see your shadow. The first man burst into the suite, his silhouette framed by the red strobe. He moved with the confidence of a predator, expecting a weeping girl. Nkiru waited behind the heavy velvet curtain. As he passed, she didn't scream, she struck. She used his own momentum against him, shoving the heavy lamp base between his feet and driving her elbow into the soft tissue of his throat, just as Taejun had shown her during their late-night lessons. The man went down, gasping for air, but a second shadow appeared in the doorway. This one was armed. Enough, the man hissed, raising a silenced pistol. Nkiru didn't freeze. She grabbed the heavy silk duvet and threw it with a violent snap, the fabric blooming in the air like a white cloud, obscuring his vision for a single, vital heartbeat. She dived for the floor, sliding across the polished wood to the nightstand. Her fingers found the hidden latch Taejun had pointed out on their third night in Seoul. The drawer slid open. The steel of the handgun was cold, heavy, and absolute. As the intruder ripped the duvet away, Nkiru leveled the weapon with both hands. Her shoulders were back. Her chin was up. She wasn't the woman who had trembled at the altar in Lagos, she was the woman who had survived the iron penthouse. "Drop it," she commanded, her voice a flat, dead line. The man froze, looking into the eyes of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Before he could react, the main doors exploded inward. Taejun was there, his face a mask of primal, focused rage. But he stopped when he saw her. He didn't see a victim needing rescue. He saw Nkiru, standing over a fallen man, her fingers steady on the trigger. The lace of her sleeves was torn, and a spray of blood stained the crimson silk of her gown, but she didn't flinch. She looked at Taejun, and for the first time, the power in the room was equal. The heat of Lagos hit Nkiru like a physical blow as she stepped off the Gulf Stream, but this time, the humidity didn't make her wilt. She wore a suit of cream-colored silk, her hair pulled back into a severe, elegant knot, and oversized dark glasses that turned the world into a calculated shade of gray. Beside her, Taejun moved with the silent authority of a storm front. They weren't here for a wedding, they were here for an audit. The confrontation took place in the very ballroom where the reception was supposed to have been held. Michael sat at a long mahogany table, flanked by his parents and a lawyer who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. The Balligans had dressed in their finest traditional lace, a desperate attempt to reclaim a status that had already been liquidated. When Nkiru entered, Michael stood up, his face a pale, sweating mask of false hope. "Nkiru, baby, I knew you'd come," Michael started, his voice cracking. "I knew you'd talk some sense into." He stopped abruptly as Taejun took the seat at the head of the table. Taejun didn't speak. He simply placed a thick, black dossier on the table and slid it toward Michael. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was the only noise in the room. "The debt is no longer with the Han Group's rivals," Nkiru said, her voice cool and resonant, echoing off the walls that had once heard her shame. "Taejun bought your markers, Michael. Every gambling debt, every stolen kobo, every lien on your family's property. You don't owe the shadows anymore. You owe us." Michael's father slammed a fist on the table. "This is an outrage. You were promised to this family. There is the matter of the dowry, the gifts. The dowry was paid in blood the moment your son used a microphone to ruin my daughter." Nkiru's father's voice wasn't the one that spoke. It was Nkiru herself, stepping forward until she stood directly over Michael. She leaned down, her shadow eclipsing him. "You wanted $5 million to save your life, Michael. I've decided to give it to you." Michael's eyes lit up with a pathetic, greedy spark. "You did?" "Nkiru, I knew. But not in cash," she whispered, her voice a lethal silk. "I've paid your creditors in full. In exchange, you have signed over the Balogun estates and your family's shares in the Port Authority. You aren't going to jail, Michael. You're going to be exactly what you tried to make me, a ghost with a famous name and nothing else to his soul." She turned to Taejun, who was watching her with an expression that bordered on pride. He rose, adjusted his cufflinks, and looked at the shivering man across the table. "My wife is generous," Taejun said, his first words of the meeting falling like heavy stones. "If it were up to me, you would have been an example. But she wanted you to live long enough to watch her rule the world you thought she wasn't good enough for." As they walked out, Nkiru didn't look back. The heat of Lagos no longer felt like a weight, it felt like a forge. The winter in Seoul had arrived in earnest, dusting the iron penthouse in a fragile, crystalline white that mirrored the diamond on Nkiru's finger. The city below was a sprawling sea of neon, but inside the glass walls, the air was still and heavy with the weight of a final decision. Taejun stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette sharp against the frozen skyline. On the obsidian desk lay 2 envelopes. One contained a black card with a limitless balance and a deed to a villa in the south of France, a clean exit, a life of luxury, and the freedom to finally outrun the shadows. The other was a heavy, wax-sealed scroll written in archaic Korean script, the formal induction into the Han family lineage. "The debt is settled, Nkiru," Taejun said, his voice a low, resonant hum in the quiet room. He didn't turn around. "Michael is a memory. Your family is secure. The world no longer remembers the girl at the altar, they only see the woman who stood her ground in the red gala." Nkiru walked toward him, her reflection in the glass no longer ghostly, but vivid and sharp. She wore a dress of midnight velvet, her posture as unyielding as the skyscrapers outside. "You're giving me a choice. I am giving you your life back," he corrected, finally turning to face her. The coldness that had once defined his gaze had been replaced by something deeper, a raw, quiet hope that he was too disciplined to voice. "If you take the first envelope, you are free of the violence, the secrets, and the man who brought you into them. You can be Nkiru's again. Nkiru looked at the envelopes, then at the man who had seen her bleed and had let her see his own scars. She thought of the woman who had walked into the Lagos Cathedral, a woman who lived for the approval of a coward. Then she thought of the woman who had held a gun in the strobe lights of this penthouse, the woman who had brought a dynasty to its knees in a Lagos ballroom. She reached out, but her hand didn't move toward the money. She picked up the Han family scroll. "I don't want to be the woman I was," she said, her voice a steady, lethal silk. "And I don't want a life where I have to hide to be safe." She stepped into his space, her eyes locking onto his with a ferocious certainty. "I didn't stay because of a contract, Taejun. I stayed because I found the only man whose shadow was big enough to match mine." Taejun didn't speak. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, not the stolen diamond Michael had used, but a band of black gold set with a rare, blood-red pigeon eye ruby. He didn't use a microphone. He didn't need an audience of 500. He simply took her hand, his thumb grazing the pulse at her wrist. "Then rule with me," he whispered. As he slid the ring onto her finger, Nkiru didn't feel like a bride. She felt like a sovereign. The girl who had been broken at the altar was gone, replaced by a queen who finally belonged to herself, and to the king who had been brave enough to claim her. This story argues that public humiliation doesn't have to be an ending, it is the precise catalyst required to burn away a weak identity and forge a stronger one. It explores the tension between performative love, Michael's public wedding spectacle, and protective loyalty, Taejun's private, decisive actions. Ultimately, it suggests that belonging isn't about fitting into a traditional social box, but about finding an equal who respects your strength as much as your vulnerability. Never mistake a woman's silence for her submission. Nkiru's value is not determined by the man who discards her, but by her own ability to master the aftermath. Nkiru chose the throne and the shadow over a safe life with a fortune. If you were left at the altar in front of everyone you knew, and a dangerous stranger offered you a way to make them all regret it, would you take his hand, or would you run? Nkiru went from a humiliated bride to the queen of an empire, but the war for soul is just beginning. If you want to see Michael's final downfall and Nkiru's first act of revenge as a mafia queen, hit that like button and subscribe. Comment, "Queen," if you think she made the right choice, or "Run," if you think Taejun is too dangerous. Follow for more chapters and hit the bell so you never miss a drop. You won't want to see what happens when the past finally catches up to the Iron Penthouse.